Welcome to the YouTube channel, Uniquely Female Troubles. In this very first episode, I want to tell you about what this channel will be about, why it's called Uniquely Female Troubles, and a little bit about myself. My name is Leslie Wells, and the reason I decided to name this channel Uniquely Female Troubles is because back a long time ago, and maybe possibly still now sometimes, if a woman was in the hospital or had had surgery or something, another person, like if you ran into somebody and you said, "Oh, I heard Betty was in the hospital. Do you know what's going on with her?" Instead of answering like, "Oh, yes, unfortunately, she has ovarian cancer," or "she's getting treatment for endometriosis," something along those lines. Instead, they would look around, make sure there's no one in hearing distance, lower their voice, and say, "Female troubles." And then the other person would say, "Oh yeah, female troubles," as if that's an answer. It's not an answer at all. The only answer that is letting you know that whatever is wrong with this lady, it's something that it can't happen to a man. And there are a lot of things that don't happen to men that do happen to women. That's just a fact of life. And there are also a lot of things that happen much more frequently to women than happen to men. And that's a fact of life too. And that's why I decided to name this channel Uniquely Female Troubles, because there are a lot of uniquely female troubles in this world. The first category would just be biology. Obviously, we have very different bodies than men do. We have very different roles to play when it comes to reproduction, having children. So of course, our bodies are very different than men's bodies. That's one category of problems that we have that men don't have. Another problem is just caused by societal norms. There are a lot of subtle things that are still negatively affecting women, and they've just always been that way. And since they've always been that way, people often resist changing them. And yet, if something has always been a certain way, and it affects 50% of the population in a very negative way, shouldn't it be changed? I think it should be. But people often resist change. We know that. That's part of human nature. And so sometimes it's very hard to change things, even when it's very obviously bad for a very huge percentage of the population. Another uniquely female trouble that men don't have to worry about is misogyny. Misogyny just means hating women. There are people that hate women just simply because we're women, which I don't understand that. I don't hate men. And so why would anybody hate women? You know, I guess I just don't understand that whole concept of hating anybody just based on their gender. And so there are people that hate women. There are people that consider women inferior to men. There are people that consider women less valuable than men. And the really sad thing is, some people who feel that way are women. And that, I don't know, that is a depth, a profound level of self-loathing. If you consider what you are so much inferior to what other people are, there's something really wrong there. And I have known a few, not very many, actually two. I have known two women for sure that are that way. And just watching them and observing them has been actually very illuminating to find out, like, I can't say that I know why they're that way. I don't. But to just see women who think men are so much better than women, I don't get it. Another category of problems we have is caused by religious patriarchy. And religious patriarchy is something that affects anyone that lives in a part of the world that is highly influenced or formed based on Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. And those three religions have something in common. It's the Old Testament. And those three religions are called people of the book. And the book that phrase is referring to is the Old Testament. Islam recognizes the Old Testament as sacred. It's a sacred text in their religion. Judaism, of course, the Old Testament is their sacred book. And in Christianity, the Old Testament and the New Testament is a sacred book. And you might say, well, I am not a religious person. I was raised by atheists. Religion has nothing to do with my life. And that might be true. But if you live in a culture that is formed by these teachings that just kind of permeate everything, then it does affect you. You might not even realize that that's where it comes from, but that is where it comes from. Some of it comes from. And so that is something else I want to explore. Religious patriarchy has had a very, very negative effect in my life. Another thing I want to talk about is history. There are many things throughout history that have been very bad for women. For instance, foot binding. And you might say, oh, that's something they used to do in China a long time ago, which is true. But you know, they didn't do it to men. They only did it to women. Why? Where did it come from? What is the effect of having your feet bound? When they bind your feet, they break almost every bone in your foot. And you have to live that way the rest of your life. And your feet don't get a chance to really heal properly, because once they put the bindings on your feet and break all those bones, it's actually just as painful to no longer wear the bindings as it is to wear the bindings. So you're really in a bad place. I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about female genital mutilation. And that's not just history. That is something that's still going on in some parts of the world, and including the US. And so that is something very important. And that's something I want to talk about in detail on a separate episode. And then the next thing, I'm going to include a playlist that is going to have original poetry that I've written that has to do with these topics. I've written a lot of poems that have to do with these topics because it's really something that is important to me. And I know poetry is not a very popular thing, but there might be some people who are watching this channel that would like to hear some poems that I wrote about that. And if there are, it's going to be there. And I might eventually branch out and read some other poems that I've written about other things. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. And maybe after I tell you my life story, you will understand why I'm starting this channel and why it's very important for me to get this information out there. Before I start telling you a little bit about my life, I need to issue some trigger warnings. I am issuing trigger warnings about CSA, child SA, RAPE, and I have to spell out words or use acronyms because of YouTube's policies. They don't want people to say certain words, which I find very weird. But, I mean, I know the context is very important, and they don't have an algorithm sophisticated enough, I should say, to actually distinguish between talking against something and talking for it. So it just flags it if you use the actual word. So I would say that my life story needs a trigger warning about CSA, RAPE, marital SA, domestic violence, and religious abuse. So when I was 5, a male relative in my family, of course, a male relative, not part of my nuclear family, began raping me in my mouth. And that was done, I have no idea how many times. He had access to me. He had a lot of access to me for many years. And I repressed that. So, that's why I don't remember how many times it was done. I don't know when he stopped doing it. I know he did stop eventually, of course. But that was going on. And even though I repressed that, I suddenly had all these really bad hang-ups about my mouth. I would not, for instance, by the time I was 5, I'd been going to the dentist for a year or 2 already, and no problem. I would just hop up in the dentist chair, open my mouth. It wasn't scary, anything. All of a sudden, I wouldn't even open my mouth. And if you tried, I would put both hands on top of my mouth, and I would not open my mouth at all. So he referred me to a pediatric dentist, and unfortunately, that lady ended up being a sadist. She was a very horrible person. And I saw her for quite a few years, and that's a whole other part of my life story that I might talk about in a different episode. And then when I was about 7, a man married into my family, an elderly man. I thought he was really old. Of course, I was only 7. And he married into our family, and he was a pedophile. And every time I walked in the room where he would tell me to sit on his lap. And I would, even though I hated sitting on his lap. Because as soon as I sat on his lap, his hands would go where they didn't belong. And I had absolutely no idea why he was doing it. I know I hated it, But I was taught that children obey grown-ups. So when he said sit on my lap, I sat on his lap. And it was, there was nothing there, but that turned him on, I guess. And so, but one day, a few years after he became part of our family, he found me alone in the basement. And he walked over to me. He picked me up. I was dangling, my feet were dangling in the air. He picked me up and got my mouth level to his mouth. And he stuck his tongue as far down my throat as it would go. And that was so terrifying. I didn't know why he was doing it. I was so young that I didn't even know that people use their tongues when they kiss. I thought kissing was just a matter of mashing two mouths, mashing their lips up together. I didn't know what kissing really was. And so I couldn't breathe, I couldn't scream, I couldn't do anything. I was just dangling in the air. And he put me down, and I started to run away, and I tripped on the basement stairs. And he laughed. He thought that was funny. And he said, "Ain't used to that yet, are you, little lady?" And no, I wasn't used to that. I didn't even know what that was. So I ran up the stairs, and what's really sad about it is that I ran right past my grandma, right past my mom, right past my dad, and I locked myself in the bathroom. I ran right past the three people who would have protected me from this man. And I did not tell them what happened. I never told them what happened until they found out a few years later. But I never, went to them and told them he did this to me. I just locked myself in the bathroom. I was crying. I was shaking. I was in there quite a while. But we did actually, it came out that what he did to me. And after that, I never saw that man again. My parents protected me from this man. And I'm very grateful to them for that. So when I was 16, after I'd been through all this kind of abuse, this SA, I should say CSA, because I was a child, I joined a toxically patriarchal cult. It was a doomsday cult called the End Time Message. It was a cult. It still is a cult. It's still very active in this world. It is a cult that follows the teachings of William Branham. He died in 1965, but this cult is going strong. There are a lot more people in this cult now than there were when he was alive, unfortunately. So I joined this cult, and it was super anti-woman, which I didn't realize that at the time. Of course, I didn't even realize it was a cult. When you join a group, you think you found something that is something you need, that's something that's really going to add value to your life. You don't join a cult thinking, I'm going to join a cult today. I'm going to join something that's going to ruin my life. Yay, I can't wait. That's not a thing. People join cults because they think they're in something good. And then eventually you get out, hopefully. I mean, some people never get out. They die still a member of the cult, which is really sad. But if you do realize you're in a cult and you get out, you're going to do one of the hardest things you could ever do in your life. Leaving a cult is one of the very hardest things anybody could ever do. And we will talk more about this cult and about just Christian patriarchy in general. That's the only kind of patriarchy I've had personal experience with. And then when I was 19, I married a guy who was not a good person to marry. And I found out something on our wedding night. Well, actually, I didn't find out on our wedding night. I experienced it on our wedding night, but I didn't know what I was experiencing. And what was interesting was 4 years earlier, I had also experienced it for the first time. The first time I experienced the fact that I was born with an abnormal hymen, I was 15, not 19. I had a boyfriend who was 18. And like all, I should say 99.9% of 18-year-old boyfriends, he wanted to have sex. And since I was only 15, but yet I was already ready to betray myself. I was ready. I did not want to do that. I was ready to give myself away to keep this guy that I thought I loved. I don't know. I feel like he was the first person I ever fell in love with. And I think I was in love with him. I was so long ago and I was so young. I don't even really know, to be honest. But anyway, I was willing to do what I didn't want to do to keep him and to please him and to make him happy and make him not want to break up with me, which is really sad. And so that morning, we attempted to have intercourse. And it was a very horrible experience. It was such a bad experience that he never wanted to try it again. And if something is bad enough to make an 18-year-old not to want to try to have intercourse with his girlfriend, you know it's bad. But being only 15 years old and being pretty messed up psychologically, not knowing, I didn't know I was at the time, but I was. When I was 19, I got married and I went on my honeymoon, not even thinking about what had happened when I was 15. I just expected to have a great wedding night. Well, it wasn't great. It was terrible. And when we started to, consummate our marriage, which we hadn't tried to do before, I felt the most horrible pain. It was so bad. I was crying. I was screaming. I was trying to get him away from me. I was pushing him away. And yet it didn't. He just kept doing what he was doing. And by the way, I apologize for that little shake. That was just in the video. I moved my foot and I bumped the tripod. But he didn't stop. He just kept doing it until he was satisfied. And that was so horrible. I didn't know what happened. And it was then that I realized, wow, this is just like what happened back then when I was 15. So I was in so much denial. And, denial is a self-protective thing. I stayed married to this guy for 22 years. So I had to have some kind of denial, I guess. I did not realize until last year, I'm 63, like I said. Back when I was 62, I finally realized the correct word for what happened to me on my wedding night. And I'm not going to say it. I don't need to say it. You guys know what it is. But that's what happened to me on my wedding night. So after we got back from our honeymoon, I kept saying, I need to go to the doctor. I need to go to the doctor. There's something really wrong with me. And he said no. He wouldn't let me go to the doctor. And unfortunately, because we were members of this cult, I allowed him to decide whether or not I would go to the doctor. I also allowed him to decide if we would continue attempting, he called it trying, to have intercourse. We did that for 6 months. It never hurt any less than the first time. It never hurt any less than it did when I was 15. It hurt so bad. And I kept telling him, I need to go to the doctor. I need to go to the doctor. And he kept saying, well, it always hurts girls the first few times. Don't ever let anybody tell you that. Yeah, it might hurt a little bit. It is not going to hurt really bad. I promise you that. And so after 6 months, I couldn't take it anymore. So I lied. I told him I had a rash down there. And all of a sudden, it was totally okay for me to go see a gynecologist. And I don't know why that is. I have no idea. So I went to the gynecologist. He knew right away what was wrong with me. He told me I was going to have surgery, which was very shocking. And I had a hymenectomy, but things weren't fixed yet. Things didn't get fixed. And that is something I'm going to talk about on the next episode, which I plan on posting the same day I post this episode. So I will tell you in detail about abnormal hymens, what types there are, what happened to me, the details of all that. And one of the main reasons I want to talk about this in particular is this is a rare condition. It's not very common. But the fact is that it happens. And I have literally never met anyone who is not a medical professional who is even aware of the fact that a person can be born with an abnormal hymen. That you can have a hymen that actually prevents you from ever having intercourse. If I hadn't got that fixed, I would never have intercourse, ever. In my entire life, I would never have a child. You can't have a child. That's just not possible. So it can totally ruin your life. And that is something I want people to know about. I want people to know what might be happening if they try to have intercourse for the first time and they are screaming because it hurts so bad. That's not normal. That is not part of this. It always hurts girls the first few times. Or like I was told, you have a very low pain tolerance. Then eventually I was told it's all in your head. Well, no, it wasn't in my head. It was in my vagina. So that is what this channel is going to be about. And I really appreciate everyone who has listened this far. Thank you so much. And this is the very first episode. And it is a little bit scary putting myself out there. But I'm also very excited about it. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And also, please subscribe to my channel and set the notifications where you will get all the notifications. You will get notified every time I post a video. And I hope a lot of people are going to want to do that. Another thing I'm really hoping is that you will share this video. I don't mean whether you share it, on YouTube, send it to somebody, or whether you just tell other people about it. If you have anybody that you think would enjoy this information or benefit from this information, please tell them about this channel. And if you have anybody in your life who has not lost her virginity yet, let her know what could happen. Not to scare her. Don't scare her. Don't make her freak out. Let her know how really rare it is. But she needs to know that if it hurts so bad that she can't tolerate it, that not to just force herself to try to do it, because it can have very negative consequences. So I'm going to talk about that in my next video. So thank you. Bye.